Hello, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to have a real treat. I would have thought from the background of this that we're seeing on my guest's screen that we're in India, but we're not. He says that he's in British Columbia, and we're going to talk about his, partly, I think, about the country he came from, India, and the nuclear policies that are so important there, nuclear weapons in particular. Good morning, MV Brahmana. How are
Good morning.
you?
I'm good. Thank you
Great.
for inviting me.
It's wonderful to meet you. We will all get acquainted at the same time. Professor and Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia. He's also director of the Liu Institute for Global and the acting director of the Center for India and South Asia Research at the Institute of Asian Research. That's a mouthful. Let's start with that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Tell me this. First off, which is India's worst friend or worst enemy, China or Pakistan? When India develops its nuclear weapons, whom does it have in mind?
That's a difficult question to answer. First of all, I would start by saying India as a whole does not have either friends or enemies. There are different groups within India and different organizations that might have different sets of motivations. And they don't all see eye to eye, obviously. But nuclear weapons, I don't think in any country really belong to the people. They are sort of elite instruments developed by very specialized and powerful organizations that would use all kinds of arguments to further their interests. So in the case of India, it has been China that has typically been the rationale offered by those who would want India to develop nuclear weapons. And this dates back to the 1960s. In fact, even before China first tested nuclear weapons in 1964, there were people in the Indian parliament belonging to the forerunner of today's government, the Hindu Nationalist Party called the Bharatiya Janata Party. They were calling for India developing nuclear weapons to counter the evil communists in Russia and Soviet Union and China. And ever since China tested in 1964, that has been the main argument made by those who would like to see India develop nuclear weapons and more kinds of delivery vehicles, to say India needs to build up its arsenal. That said, there has been a long-standing dispute between India and Pakistan. Both of them, of course, were one and the same entity prior to 1947 under the British. And then, the partition was a very violent event, which left this area of Kashmir as a disputed one, where both countries are trying to exercise their control over a set of people who might not want to belong to either of them. That's a separate story. But that said, the Kashmir conflict has been one that has triggered numerous military confrontations between India and Pakistan, including twice after 1998, when the two countries tested nuclear weapons. Right? And so in a way, that's the arena where one is most worried about nuclear weapons being used, because in both 1999 over the conflict over Kargil, and then in 2019 when there was a suicide bomber who killed around 40 odd paramilitary troops, and there was a sort of conflict between India and Pakistan, there were nuclear threats that were issued by high-level people on both sides. Right? And so the conflict with Pakistan is definitely one that is more concerning. But China, because it's a much larger country, because it has a larger military footprint, and because it has a larger nuclear arsenal, has been the consistent argument for people who want to enlarge India's nuclear arsenal.
Well, there have been some military confrontations. I know. I remember in the '60s, and up in the mountains, and again in the same, I guess, general area, isn't it? More recently, I don't know whether that's over or not. I haven't heard anything about that, but a few months ago, there was military action there.
Absolutely. So that conflict has been ongoing. There's been a border dispute between India and China since the late 1950s,
Mhm.
which has led to there was one major sort of military confrontation in 1962, and then subsequently much smaller ones and more localized ones in many areas. And
But
yeah, that's
I
one.
assume that none of those looked ominous enough to even be thinking about nuclear weapons.
Yes, to the best of our
Yeah.
knowledge, that is true.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. Well, so I've thought it would be interesting to get you and oh dear, this lovely man in Pakistan that anyway, he has certainly been very critical of the Pakistani nuclear weapons program. And I've often wondered whether there has been any dialogue between people in the two countries about their, no, you couldn't do that.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely, yes. So the peace movements in both countries have had a constant dialogue for decades. And in the very specific area of nuclear weapons and nuclear arms control and disarmament, I have worked closely with other Pakistani colleagues. So when I was back in Princeton, my colleague Zia Mian and I used to run a program which would bring together physicists. Both of us were physicists, so we tended to focus on sort of more technical areas. Along with Frank von Hippel and Hal Fiverson and so on. So we brought together Professor Rajaraman from India, an activist called Sandeep Pandey, and then from Pakistan, Professor Pervez Hoodboy and Professor Nair.
Hoodboy, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Pervez Hoodboy, thank you.
Yeah, Pervez is an old friend. We've worked together many times.
I bet it's harder to talk with people in China about their program, though, isn't it?
It is, yes. I mean, I must unfortunately say yes to that. I mean, it's not that we don't have friends who are in China and so on, who we work with closely, Li Bin and Tong Zhao and people like that. But there has been much less space for any kind of arms control agreements between India and China. And we're trying to sort of talk about what might be possible, but it's harder, definitely. We should not see this as an India-Pakistan problem or even as an India-China-Pakistan problem, but actually as an India, US, China, and Pakistan. It's a four-way race with each of them feeding off each other. And that's, I think, the great challenge there.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, I think that probably in China, it's almost forbidden for a scientist to say something critical about the country's military policies in general. Wouldn't that be the case, that would not be an easy thing for people to do?
Yeah, it is not easy, but I think that there are some very brave people who do talk about things. And also, over a period of time, what you learn to do when you work with them is to read between the lines.
Declared policies of these countries should, I think, influence, or maybe shouldn't influence our opinion about what people are likely to do when push comes to shove.
In the case of India, India also has a no first use policy, as it were, but a somewhat more watered down one as in comparison to China. It has a lot of exceptions to when it might use nuclear weapons, including it has made exceptions for countries that are allied with nuclear weapon states and also with countries that might be using chemical or biological weapons. That said, I think the problem with no first use declarations is that they are just declarations. And no one, especially countries like on the other side, the potential victims of these attacks, such as Pakistan, might not necessarily believe in those. Right? Pakistani leaders have often said, "Oh, we don't believe that India is actually going to not use nuclear weapons." Right? So that's one
It's
issue.
a fair question, I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
you can't help wondering, well, so So
right?
words
Then you
don't
can,
mean much
yeah,
necessarily.
but then you can look a little deeper. And I had a paper a few years ago with a young Indian researcher called Kumar Sundaram, where we looked at what has been the history of the no first use statement by India, what's been its role, and so on. And what we found were two things. One is that, or maybe three things. One is that during crisis, if you look at statements made by senior political leaders, including as high as the prime minister, those statements do not quite comport with the understanding of what one might have of no first use. In other words, if it's a strict no first use agreement or policy, then one should say, I'm going to wait for the nuclear weapon to actually explode in Delhi or wherever, and then we will decide what we're going to do. In actuality, what they will say is, the moment we think there is a credible threat of an attack, we will be ready to launch nuclear weapons, right? And they will not say it in those very blunt terms, but it's sort of more veiled, but that's what you can read. So in
Well,
other words,
critical threat is one thing, but does that cover, we know that there's a missile on the way? I mean, that's more than a critical.
yeah. So there's no, these are not statements which are made in public, right? As I said, you have to sometimes read between the lines. Yeah, but even in the case of missiles flying, and we know that the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia have these massive early warning systems, satellites and radars and so on, and they often make mistakes, right? They often have false alarms. And so, the idea that, I am seeing a missile coming, you have to ask, what does it really mean? I mean, you're not seeing it with your own eyes, right? You're being told by a very complicated machinery that there's an incoming missile, and you have to choose to whether you trust it or not. And there's good reason not to trust these things when they happen, right? So that's, I think, one point to remember. The second thing to note in the case of India is that if you look at the way the kind of delivery vehicles India is developing and deploying, that suggests that a quick launch might be possible. They are developing what are called canisterized missiles, which can be mobile and can shoot from essentially any place. And the question is, why would you want to be developing those kinds of things? They sort of seem to go a little bit against a no first use.
A quick launch would be so quick that it could be launched while the incoming missile is in flight, right? Is that the kind
that could be one.
The notion is you've got to launch, if you want to keep your missiles, you have to launch them before the other guy gets to you, right?
So that, I think that's not something which is that idea which is true which is used in the United States and Russia does not apply to South Asia.
I see.
Because for two reasons. One is they don't have the kind of ICBM capabilities, ICBM forces that are located in specific silos, right? They're all mobile missiles.
Oh.
And the numbers of missiles are too small for any country to be confident that they'll be able to hit the other side's missiles and then have still some leftover to be able to attack other cities and so on and so forth. So that what is, the kind of a lot of South Asia's nuclear policies are modeled after the United States and Russia, but not all of them. Mm-hmm. The final thing I wanted to say is that what Sundaram and I discovered as we looked at the record was that the primary purpose for the no first use declaration by India, as far as we can make out, is a diplomatic one. It allows India to go into all kinds of international fora and then say, see, we are very responsible countries. We are going to be very careful about how we use nuclear weapons. And the country on the other side of our border is not like that, right? And so it's a way for Indian diplomats to score brownie points over Pakistan, right?
So in other words, Pakistan doesn't even pretend.
No, so Pakistan's status is very different. So Pakistan's military leaders are extremely concerned about the possibility that India can easily overwhelm them using conventional military might. right? So there's always the danger that the tanks will start rolling into the plains of the Punjab, and within, a few hours, they will be in Lahore and all kinds of, they will just overtake stuff, right? And so they have always said, we have a set of red lines, and once you cross those red lines, we are willing to use nuclear weapons, right? Because we cannot try to deal with your military might using our conventional military might.
Mhm,
Of
mhm.
military forces. So Pakistan's position is very different from that of India in that sense. And what Pakistan would say then is to say, instead of a no first use agreement, how about we agree to a no war agreement? Right? How about we have a pact not to ever go into war, right? And India would say, no, we can't do that, because that will only allow you to keep doing, to keep supporting terrorist activities in Kashmir and so on and so forth. And so this is turtles all the way down kind of spiral, all right? So both of them are, and so again, along with my colleagues in between, that I mentioned earlier, Zia and Nair and Sandeep, we have sort of tried to advance the idea that there should be a kind of a no war pact that encompasses all kinds of activities that would be proscribed on both sides. That would be the way forward. Anyway, so there are ways to try and deal with the situation there. At least there are, theoretically speaking. The political reality is that it is right now very, very difficult to advance any of these things, but that's a separate story, right? But I want to come back to what I was trying to say. So I think Pakistan has a set of red lines, and the problem for India, therefore, has been, okay, so if Pakistan is willing to use nuclear weapons at a very early stage in any kind of conflict, then what do we do with all of the conventional military forces we have accumulated, right? And so they have come up with these, shall we say, strategies. One is usually called cold start. The idea being that if there is some kind of a conflict that breaks out, then Indian forces should be ready to launch some kind of a military attack at very short notice, well before Pakistan uses nuclear weapons, but also before international diplomatic forces come in and stop India from doing anything. Right. So the scenario is, let's say there is an explosion in Kashmir, and India thinks it is some Pakistani intelligence group or some group that's associated with Pakistan. They would like to be able to bomb a target within Pakistan, right? And before anybody says, oh, let's all sit down and talk about it, don't do anything, because the Indian military would say, what's the point in us having all of these weapons if we can't use it under these circumstances, right?
Okay.
And Pakistan's response to that is, okay, you guys do anything of that sort, we will lower our threshold for using nuclear weapons, right? And so it's a very destabilizing scenario there.
Has it changed since the current regime, Modi, has come to power? Because he's certainly not a very nice guy, frankly.
Yeah.
And I would think that if I were living in Pakistan, I might be even more nervous than before.
Yes.
Tell me.
Absolutely. The simple answer is yes. It's become worse in some ways. It's not the problem is that Modi has come to power promising a bunch of economic, shall we say, outcomes, right? Increased numbers of jobs and this and that. And the problem is, this is not like a cup of coffee that you can go to a restaurant and order, right? This is something which is dependent on so many different factors. And so whenever that economic outcome is not coming up, or when there's some election coming up, basically what the Hindu Nationalist Party and its allies do is to say, we can turn on one of those enemies. The enemy could be the outside enemy, namely Pakistan, or it could be internal, that is all kinds of minorities within India, right? And create some kind of emotional response that might be conducive to it winning elections. And this has been the strategy that they've been using in some ways. And it is very dangerous.
I talk to people all the time who are concerned about internal problems in India, the
Mhm.
actual abuse, human rights abuses that are increasing, and the lack of, well, people would now say it's not a democracy, although he was certainly elected. Um, but I don't hear as much about the diplomatic contacts and so on. Is there any potential there that you see, or have you been involved with anything that would give you, there's no hope?
No, I don't think very much,
Mhm.
at least not on the horizon. I mean, one always sort of lives in hope, or one hopes that something will change, but I don't see anything happening very, very soon. So I
But
don't want to.
the rest of the world should be concerned because, when we talk about the nuclear threat, the most persuasive argument that I think people like me, activists can put out is the nuclear winter theory, which is more than a theory, it's a real likelihood. And the example that's always used of what the worst that might happen, or the most likely bad thing that might happen, would be a war between India and Pakistan, a nuclear war. And they always talk about how that would start fires in cities that would then just, really wreck the rest of the world pretty much by the smoke and so on.
I'm not a climate modeler, so I don't, claim to understand that very well. And I believe there are uncertainties there, and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences is just, setting up a panel to look into that. So that's one point. The second thing I would say is that, although the situation in India and Pakistan is, and China and so on, there are, there are real dangers of nuclear weapons being used. One should not discount other areas where nuclear weapons can be used either. So to kind of blanketly say, that's the most likely side, ignores, for example, confrontations that happen, for example, in Ukraine between the US and Russia, or in the South China Sea between the US and China, right?
Mhm.
So there are multiple places where this can happen. And, and also what we were talking about earlier, these early warning satellites, sort of early warning systems having false alarms, that's something which can happen in places which have early warning systems, which are the United States and Russia, more likely than anywhere else, because the other places don't have early warning systems
Right.
of this kind, right? So it's very hard, I think, to predict where nuclear weapons might first be used. One hopes it never is used, but I would not say that it's only India and Pakistan. We just saw, for example, that the UK decided to increase its nuclear arsenal, right? And what else is going to go along with that? Is it going to increase the risk of nuclear war there? It's quite possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to sort of make the South Asian region as being special in terms of the nuclear threat. It is one of the areas where nuclear threat is definitely possible.
Well, you certainly bring up the one that's on our minds this week, the British intention to increase their Trident
Yes,
arsenal. And as a matter of fact, Friday, we are scheduled for a conversation about that with Paul Meyer, whom I'm sure you know, as to what is the most likely. I think probably maybe you and I might agree that the most likely would be an accident, or in the mistaken false alarm kind of thing. I think
it's
that
not that somebody is going to get up one morning and say, okay, today I'm going to order a nuclear war. It's possible, but I think that's much less likely than, in some moment of crisis or some, and again, the false alarm depends on what kind of situation is going on at the same time, how seriously these false alarms are taken.
there certainly have been wars that have happened by mistake. I mean, you might even say World War I was kind of, something that just got out of control. And if we're set up now to have things that could easily get out of control, then that's where we ought to put our attention. And
I mean, if I may draw an analogy, in the nuclear energy space, we talk about accidents there, and why nuclear reactors are prone to accidents. And I think the best theoretical understanding we have of that is by a sociologist called Charles Perrow, wrote a famous book called Normal Accidents way back in the 1980s, where he looked at the 3 Mile Island accident and a whole bunch of other hazardous technologies to isolate a couple of properties, what he called interactive complexity and tight coupling, right? And since then, and so I think that's a reason why all nuclear power plants are prone to accidents. I mean, it doesn't mean that accidents are going to be frequent, but that you cannot rule them out. But if you look at those properties and you think about how nuclear forces and military forces in general are deployed across the world, there are a lot of these elements that you can see there, right? They're highly complex. These different parts interact with each other. Sometimes actions happen very quickly in succession, and what Pero calls tight coupling. And so there are enough structural factors that also predispose the possibility of war in many, many places.
I think most of us in the peace movement, disarmament activists tend to be oriented towards stopping one weapon system after another individually. If somebody comes in with a new gadget, a new toy in some other country, we try to block it and usually fail. But nevertheless, what you're pointing there to would be a systems approach of explaining why we want to decouple things and decentralize decision making and that kind of thing. Is that right? And how would we go about reorganizing the peace movement to orient it in that way, so that we think in those terms rather than just trying to stop one system being developed after another?
So I would, before I get to how to reorient the peace movement, let me first make one point about the first thing, which is that sometimes the policies that we might support or the systems we may be opposing are being opposed for essentially the same reason. So for example, Bruce Blair, the late Bruce Blair, who was in Princeton as well, and who was for many, many years calling for an end to launch on warning postures, trying to de-alert nuclear weapons. De-alerting is a great way to reduce the coupling, right? Because your response has to be weighted and measured as opposed to instantaneous or with very short time period, right? So that's a way by which you're actually reducing the coupling between two different actions, the incoming missile and the reaction to it, right?
Okay.
So those are an example of, even sometimes when we don't think about it in those terms, because we're not thinking about it in as a system that is prone to accidents of certain kinds, right? But if you were to think about it in those terms, you might identify some of those patterns here as well. Now, coming to the peace movement at large, I would just step back from that position of trying to reorient peace movements, because I think it's hard enough to get people to come to do these kinds of work. So whatever inspires them, I'm fine with that, right? If you like writing to your local MP or senator and oppose a particular bill, whatever it is, do it, right? Something is better than nothing. This is the way I think about it. So I don't want to prescribe what the peace movement ought to be doing, and to each his own, and may a thousand flowers bloom.
Okay, certainly I'm not going to quarrel with that. It's a very admirable point of view. At the same time, I would say that some of the points that you mentioned, that Chick Perot mentioned, are things that apply in other areas of disaster as well. I mean, I think that our vulnerability, for example, to a cyber attack, cyber in particular, is an example of a way in which the high integration of the world into a system means that a little breakdown in one place or a deliberate attack in one place can have ramifications that are horrendous. So if we start thinking in terms of systems and how to put in breaker switches or something of that kind, then I think it applies to more than one threat. And but because I think we need to think of the world as really we work on 6 different global threats, and I see the interdependence that among them, such that trying to solve any one of them is impossible unless you work on one of at least one or two of the others. So a
I, I,
systemic analysis is, I think, a good way
that's
to go.
right.
And I'm glad you folks are
Yeah.
doing it. Academics do it, but I think peace activists tend not to. We all
And you know,
tend to
another natural
ourselves.
thing that we can, comes up within the, anti-nuclear weapons movement is what kind of a position do we have about nuclear energy, right? Which in turn is connected to the question of climate change, right? Because
Mhm.
the latest argument for nuclear energy has been we can solve climate change, right? I don't think that's a valid argument. That's a separate point. But coming back to this thing, there is that connection between two big threats that we face, which is the
Mhm.
risk of nuclear weapons use and the risk of catastrophic climate change.
Absolutely. That is the key connection, I think. And I'm glad you mentioned it because I wanted to turn to nuclear power because you've done work not only in nuclear weapons, but because you do see, as I think is very realistic, you can't really separate nuclear energy issues from nuclear weapons issues because, well, maybe you want to elaborate on your own attitudes about this.
Definitely. Thank you for that question. I think the connections between the two are um, sort of deep and inextricable in a way, right? And this is something which actually we've known since the beginning of the atomic age, right? If you look at the 1946 HSN-Lilienthal report, they says that explicitly, right? And various people have emphasized the connections between the two. Ted Taylor, the brilliant nuclear weapons designer who turned into a nuclear disarmament activist, could always see in any nuclear power plant the possibility of producing plutonium or, other kinds of materials to use
But
in nuclear weapons.
isn't it? I mean, sorry to interrupt, but I think every nuclear power plant in the world has to produce plutonium. They can't help it,
Yes.
right?
And
So,
so, yeah, exactly. So the other thing which I think, so just to put it, so there's a technical connection that every nuclear plant has either produces plutonium, or in most countries around the world, other than Canada and a few other countries which have heavy water reactors, they also require enriched uranium. So the centrifuges that produce the enriched uranium can be repurposed to produce uranium that's enriched enough to be able to use in nuclear weapons. And the so-called thorium reactors, for example, will produce uranium-233, which is also usable in nuclear weapons,
oh, I
right?
didn't know
So,
that. That
yeah,
is because people who talk about thorium talk about it how it's safer, but you just blew that
definitely.
argument out of the water.
No, it's not at all, because thorium by itself cannot be used in a nuclear reactor. It's not fissile, right? It does not undergo a chain reaction. So you have to convert it in some fashion to uranium-233, which is the fissile material, right? So the question is whether you can isolate the uranium-233 or not. And the details of it will depend on the particular reactor design. And in most cases, I cannot claim to have seen every thorium reactor design, so I'm not going to make a blanket statement. But the point is that the physics of it is such that you cannot run a nuclear plant without producing uranium-233. And then the only question is, can you find a process through which I can isolate the uranium-233? And in most cases, the answer is yes. Right, if not all cases. I'm not saying all cases only because I've not seen all nuclear reactor designs.
I think we need to explain why that isolating it is important.
Yes. Well, to make a nuclear weapon, you need to have a fairly pure quantity of either plutonium or uranium-235 or uranium-233, right? So highly enriched uranium is something which has more than 20% of uranium-235. Uranium found in nature is about 0.7% of uranium-235. Uranium-235 is the isotope of uranium that can undergo fission. And to make nuclear weapons, typically that fraction, that isotope, has to be concentrated to around 90% or more, right? But uranium-233 is another isotope of uranium that can also be used to make nuclear weapons. And in some ways, it's actually better than uranium-235 because you require less of it to make a nuclear weapon.
Okay.
It has a smaller critical mass, as they say, right?
Mhm.
And it's also better than plutonium in some ways because it has a less of what's called a spontaneous fission process, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages to each of them. But the essential point, I think, coming back to where we started, is that all nuclear power plants are technically linked to nuclear weapons. But there are two other linkages which I think are very important, which are often forgotten. One is that you require you require very similar kinds of expertise in either building nuclear power plants or the fuel chain that supports it, as well as nuclear weapons. You need to have a bunch of nuclear engineers and chemists and all kinds of people who would be able to do one or the other. And we see this in many countries. So we talked about India. So India's nuclear personnel initially benefited a lot by coming to Canada and the United States uh, to be trained in all kinds of these aspects. And then they went back and they set up a nuclear power program nominally, which eventually started building nuclear weapons. Right. So there's a sort of a overlap in terms of people. And finally, there's an institutional overlap. So if you look at many of the institutions that develop nuclear power, some of them decide that they can get more political power and financial support if they also develop nuclear weapons. And again, India is the country that I'm most familiar with, is probably the best example, because the Atomic Energy Commission in India was set up originally to only do peaceful purposes of atomic energy, right? But then by the 1960s, it had decided that it's probably good if we can also get onto the nuclear weapons bandwagon. And other countries have done similar sorts of things. But also, ironically, the converse is true. So what you see today, which is, I think, more interesting thing, is that in many countries where nuclear power, which is increasingly seen as uneconomical because its costs are so high, and the cost of alternatives, especially solar and wind, have been plummeting, the companies that own nuclear power plants and other advocates for nuclear power, they make this argument very centrally in the United States, in the UK, in France, saying, look, we need to maintain these nuclear power plants because we have nuclear weapons, and the infrastructure to make nuclear weapons and the personnel that are required to run the nuclear submarines and all kinds of things come from these nuclear power plant industries, right? The fact that you have this large pool of people, you can draw on them, and you can also feed them back. So a lot of people who work in nuclear power plants in the United States come from what's called the nuclear navy, the large number of nuclear submarines that the United States operates, right? So it's a great jobs program for people who go into the nuclear navy in their 20s, and then they come out in their 30s or 40s, and they need a job for the rest of their lives. And so this is an obvious place where they go. And you see, high-level people, Ernie Moniz, the former Department of Energy Secretary under Obama, the moment the Trump administration comes to power, this is the best argument that he has. He says, oh, Trump administration, you guys don't care about climate change and so on, but we think that you should be supporting nuclear power and subsidizing the nuclear power plants in order that we are able to maintain our nuclear weapons industry. And the same thing happened in the UK when the Trident program was starting in the mid-2010s, 2015, 2016. This is the argument that they make. Why should we subsidize Hinkley Point? Because we need people, we need expertise to be able to build the Trident submarine. And the most recent example we can see of that is France, right? Macron made this argument, the French nuclear industry is in really bad shape right now. All of its flagship projects are way behind schedule and way over cost.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. I hadn't heard that. So what's the matter in particular with, is there something special going on in France that would explain why they're lagging or not?
Well, the French developed this new reactor design called the EPR, European Pressurized Reactor. And they are building these two flagship projects, one in Finland in a place called Olkiluoto, and one in France in a place called Flamanville. Both of those, construction started in the mid-2000s, and they were all supposed to have ended by the end of that decade. They're still going on. They're still not complete. There are any number of problems that have been coming up, and the most recent one of them has to do with some kind of welding issues. And there's been a history of sort of cheating, essentially, that the company that is building these things is sort of hiding various mistakes that they made, right? And anyway, so I don't want to get into all the details of that, but the point is, don't have any orders except for one nuclear power plant they're building in the UK, the Hinkley Point, which is probably the most expensive power plant that is being built ever, right? And they have almost no chance of building another one anywhere else, right? Including within France, right? And then simultaneously, the company that's building these things, EDF, its financial performance has been abjectly poor, right? And the French, Court of Accounts has basically called them on that. And so the nuclear industry in France is in really bad shape, right?
Well, worldwide, isn't it? I mean, the impression I have is that people nowadays talk mostly about the comparison between sustainable sources of energy and nuclear, and say that the cost is just, that the nuclear is always way more expensive and takes too long to develop, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yet you certainly find plenty of people, including Bill Gates, most recently and most probably influentially, arguing that there's no other way, that you have to do it. Do you want to take on that question?
Sure.
Please do, because I can't, I'm not competent to answer those folks, but I'm surrounded by friends who take that position.
So let's take Bill Gates for an example, right?
Okay.
So Bill Gates has been saying this for many, many years, right? He started a company called TerraPower and put in, I don't know how much, maybe $10 million, $20 million. I don't know what it is. He's put a certain amount of money into that. And they have developed some, paper designs, all right? Or computer PowerPoint designs, as I like to point them. Nobody has ever built one of these things, so we don't really know how they will operate. Right, that's okay. Now, then what does Bill Gates do, right? To develop from this PowerPoint design to something that is detailed enough so that a nuclear regulator can look at it and decide whether it is safe or not, requires the conducting of numerous tests, of a lot of experimental data has to be obtained, and so on and so forth, right? It costs roughly something of the order of $1 billion to $2 billion to move from one of these paper designs to a fully developed design, which can be constructed. Right. So just to give a sort of data point, the company called NewScale that is developing a small modular reactor in the United States, last year it announced that it had spent close to $1 billion already and is expecting to spend something like $500 to $700 million more before it can actually be constructed, right? So the amount of money that Gates has invested is nowhere near that kind of amount, right? But he definitely has that kind of money in his bank account, right? Why doesn't he just put it and develop it? He doesn't do that. What he does is he puts his little bit of money, and then he goes to Washington, and then he goes to Beijing and says, governments, please fund us, right? And so they got $80 million last year from the government to develop the natrium reactor design, right? So it's a very good return on his investment as far as he's concerned, right? So, it's not, to me, it's not clear to me that, he's sort of, he's not in it for the money, as it were, right? That he's doing it out of sort of selfless, concern about the environment and climate change. So that's one thing about Bill Gates.
Well, it's a funny kind of profitability, though, when profitability in a charity or something where you're donating the money is a little different. I have to consider that much.
I agree. I'm not saying it's profitable in the narrow sense of investment, but I'm just pointing out to you that the whole thing is about if you think about it as a venture capitalist, what you do is you put in money into a whole bunch of industries, and you hope that one of them is going to make it big, right? Not necessarily with the hope that all of them are going to make it big, right? And the hope is that you invest in 20 companies and one of them will become a Facebook, or one of them will become something else that makes you that $20 billion right back. That's the hope, right? So that's one point. Now, coming to the larger question, I think there are three. So coming back, okay, sorry, I'm trying to tell you too many different things. In terms of Bill Gates himself and this particular reactor design, these designs are known to be problematic. They are sodium-cooled designs. We've had a long experience with them, and sodium is a very difficult material to work with. It interacts poorly with water, with air. and lots of fires and leaks in many, many sodium reactors. And all of the experience you had shows that sodium cooled reactors cost more to build and takes longer and don't operate as well, right? So why is he doing this? Because somebody must have told him, oh, we have solved all those problems. And, I mean, who knows what kind of, checking he's done and who is he listening to, okay? Okay, now coming back to the larger question, does nuclear power sort of help with climate change or not, mitigation? I think the answer is there are three sets of reasons you can think about why nuclear power is not going to help. One is nuclear power is undesirable for a number of reasons that we have talked about, right? It is prone to accidents. It produces this radioactive waste that we don't have a solution for so far, at least demonstrated solution yet. And it is deeply linked with nuclear weapons, a large expansion of nuclear power. The second is the question of feasibility, right? So if you take any kind of reasonable climate target, 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, that comes with a set of requirements for how fast we need to lower our emissions. So what has become quite popular in the last few years has been the 2018 IPCC report that said that we need to cut our emissions by 50% by 2030. Mm-hmm. Now, a nuclear power plant takes roughly of the order of a decade to build. And it takes about a decade before that to get the necessary permits and, most importantly, raise the billions of dollars you require to actually build it, right? You have to run around to a whole bunch of banks and investors and so on and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So if, for example, British Columbia today does not have any nuclear power, if British Columbia were to decide, for whatever reason, that they are going to build a nuclear power plant, it'll be 15 to 20 years before we see the first unit of electricity being generated by that nuclear power plant, right? Mm-hmm. So on the scale of 2030, it is not going to really make any difference, right? Okay. So in terms of time scale, I think nuclear power just doesn't work, right?
In terms of time, excuse me, but in terms of time scale, I think that must be part of the argument that we can't shift over quickly enough to sustainable sources. I think that must, I haven't heard the whole argument.
Definitely, there are, this is not, so let me say one thing. We cannot say for sure that we are going to actually meet any of these climate challenges, right? There is no existence proof, as it were, that we will be able to lower our emissions. And the only question is whether we do it using renewables or climate or nuclear power. All I'm pointing out to you is that our best bet is with renewables because they have become cheaper, they are faster to build, and storage technology is becoming cheaper. But I'm not saying necessarily that we will be able to meet the climate challenge using that, because I think to meet the climate challenge is a much bigger question. And I think to really be honest, you'll have to ask the question, can we as societies, as countries, continue to keep growing on a finite planet, right? On a finite planet, you cannot keep having infinite growth, right? So ultimately, we live unsustainable lives, right? Not just us individually, but as societies, the way we have structured our political and economic systems always will make it unsustainable, right? So until we actually get a hold of that much larger problem and solve that, we are not going to deal with the climate. We're not going to be able to solve the climate change problem in that sense, right? So what we are talking about is a much narrower question, which is, if I'm going to try to reduce emissions, right? What are my best bets? What's the best investment on my dollar, as it were? Because ultimately, in our current economic system, there's only going to be a finite amount of money that's going to be invested in climate mitigation. And we have to make these choices. Do you invest those scarce dollars into building solar and wind and storage and doing all kinds of things which are required to meet the challenges of the variability of these sources? Or are you going to focus on these technology that we can predict a priori that will not be able to contribute to real climate mitigation within the time scale that we require? Right? Mm-hmm. And that you have to remember is, as we talked about multiple times, nuclear power is a very expensive source of power. So for every unit of power that you build in nuclear power, you're losing out something like 8 units of solar technology or something like that, right? So there is a huge investment, what should you say, loss or investment misallocation when you're investing into nuclear power, right? Lost opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
opportunity cost. Sorry, that's the term I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
let's turn to one other remaining issue that is very live in Canada now and probably elsewhere, the small modular nuclear reactor. And I'd like to situate it in the context of the question of reprocessing, because reprocessing for military, in terms of the threat of spreading nuclear weapons, is a very dangerous thing. And there's a question of whether of what these nuclear reactors do, these small things do. And most recently, I've seen in my incoming email a debate about whether or not Pierre Trudeau actually forbade any kind of reprocessing, which would, if that rule were still standing or is still standing, would mean that the small nuclear reactors that are being planned would be illegal, to put it too concisely. Can you elaborate on what I would have said if I could have?
Yeah. So I don't want to get into the debate over whether Trudeau sort of forbade it or not. I don't know enough about Canadian history to be able to answer that question. But I think the points I would make is that, yes, if you are talking about technologies that require plutonium as fuel, then you will be assisting in making nuclear weapons. There is just no way you can escape out of it. So if you were to raise this question about reprocessing, my guess would be those people who are building any of these small modular reactors that you're thinking about in New Brunswick would say, oh, no, we are not doing reprocessing. We are doing something else. All right. And what that something else is we don't want to get into that. But the simple way to think about it is this. When plutonium is produced inside a nuclear reactor, in the CANDU reactors, for example, it comes along with a lot of other radioactive materials, so-called fission products, which are extremely they emit gamma rays and beta ray, all kinds of things, which make it very difficult for you to go near it, to be able to do anything with it, right? So this is why they have to be underwater and then eventually put inside, casks and kept away from people, right? In order to be able to make any kind of fuel with it, you have to get rid of a lot of those fission products, right? And a lot of the debate is over whether what you're producing is pure plutonium or plutonium with other things in it, right? But whatever those other things are, you still have to eliminate most of these fission products. Otherwise, this thing will be too radioactive to handle by people who are working in uranium fuel factories, right? And so that material will automatically be more usable from nuclear weapons, because the amount of work you'll have to do to convert that into pure plutonium is far less compared to what you'll have to do with a spent fuel, which is fully radioactive, right? So anything that makes it possible to convert spent fuel into fuel will also help convert that into plutonium that is usable for nuclear weapons, right? So there is no escaping that, right? That's just the nature of radioactive materials. It's just the nature of how you have to, the interaction between radioactivity and people, right? So there is no way that you can encourage the construction of these plants without simultaneously making it possible for making the production of nuclear weapons more easily. Right? Now, the next question is, okay, so you can say, well, Canada has decided not to build nuclear weapons, so why do we bother about it? Because all of these SMR designers, their business model is based on building large numbers of these and presumably exporting them to all over the world, right? So then you have the question of, okay, what happens if some other country buys this and does this, right? So I think they're all deeply intertwined. Right? You cannot sort of extricate one from the other.
When I use the word reprocessing, I may have made a confusion there, because you're talking about anything that makes it easier to capture and separate the plutonium out. Isn't that reprocessing? You didn't use that word.
Yeah, I did that deliberately because, so I think you're right. Reprocessing is, anything that is used to separate out plutonium, right? And some of these newer nuclear reactor designs, they use a slightly different process, which they call pyroprocessing, all right? And they want to distinguish that from reprocessing by saying, we don't do what is traditionally done in reprocessing plants. So in traditional reprocessing plants, so-called Purex process, what they do is to take fuel and dunk it in hot acid. I mean, chop it up and dunk it in hot acid, where all the cladding materials, the metal stuff that is metallic alloys that surround the nuclear fuel, gets dissolved into the acid. And then the uranium and the plutonium come out, and then you do a series of chemical operations that try to isolate out the plutonium. Right? In a pyroprocessing thing, it's done using electrolysis, and we don't need to get into all those details. But the point, as I said again, is that any of these processes, whether it's pyroprocessing or aqueous reprocessing or some other form of reprocessing, the main aim is to take away most of the fission products, the radioactive fission products, right? The moment you take away most of them, the material becomes less radioactive, more easy to handle, and therefore more easy to be able to divert into nuclear weapons. That's all I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. And that's enough for me to say, let's do something else instead.
We have been spectacularly wrong on so many times on the future of energy technologies, right?
Well, yes, and talk just 1 second or more about fusion. What, that's not on the horizon quick enough to make any difference, is it?
Absolutely. So, as a physicist, I have to say that, fusion is a very interesting problem to work on, right? As a scientist, there's an endless number of problems that you can grapple with, and it's exciting and maybe something that people would like to research. But as somebody in a school of public policy, I have to say that I cannot think about fusion becoming important for any kind of policy decision, right? In terms of climate policy, in terms of energy policy. And the reason, one of my colleagues back in Princeton, and he once kind of in a joking fashion said, when I started working on nuclear fusion as a graduate student in the 1970s, we used to say commercial fusion is 30 years away. Now I've retired, and now we say it's 40 years away, right?
I've heard the same joke. If everybody says that.
Yeah. I think, but I think the physics challenge is, can you design something that produces more energy than you put in, right? And the reason I'm asking that question is because in order for things to fuse, you have to heat them to very high temperatures so that the nuclei come close enough to each other. And you do that by either zapping them with lasers or putting them in these magnetic confinement things and heating them to a high plasma temperature, all of which takes a huge amount of energy, right? So the first challenge is, can you actually produce enough energy out of this than all the energy you put in to do that? They can produce a certain amount of energy, but it happens over a very short period of time, right? Now, for us to think about a source of electricity, we want something that's generating energy all the time, or at least a lot of the time, right? Like even if I'm thinking about wind or solar, it generates 15% of the time, 20% of the time. These are operating for microseconds, and then it takes a month for you to put together the next experiment. So that's not a reasonable way of generating electricity. And then finally, there's an economic challenge. Can you do all of this at a cost that is reasonable or competitive, right? And so I don't see fusion, any reason to expect that fusion will meet all of these challenges.
Your ability to compress everything into an intelligent presentation on the fly is very wonderful. And it's also been fun to get to know you.
Finally. Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate this so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.